Welcome back to Is It Worth It Reviews. Today we are going to talk about Aiyima A70 Mono amps that are also based on this Texas Instrument TPA3255 chip amplifier, and this would be my fifth model that I've reviewed based on the same chip. And while most of them sounded very similar, having similar qualities, some comments claim that Aiyima is doing it the best and actually different than the others. And for starters, these monoblocks are going for $145 when you count in power supply. You can buy them without power supplies. That makes no sense. So two of these, basically $300. So things that Aiyima is doing differently from competition. First of all, they are using GaN, gallium nitride, or something like that. I'm not sure how you pronounce it in English, but these new GaN modules are slightly different from older switching power supplies because they enable more efficiency, and you can make smaller but equally powerful power supplies, or just equal in size but more powerful power supplies because the technology itself is more efficient. And what Aiyima did here is that they made 48 volts 5 ampere power supply for each of these monoblocks in a really small form factor. So that's it about power supply. About the amplifier itself, what Aiyima did to distinguish itself is they leaned heavily on subwoofer connectivity and usability of this amp with subwoofers. So if you take a look at the back, you'll see XLR balanced input, then RCA input, of course speaker outputs, but there is also subwoofer output. And this one in the back over RCA connector is a line output, basically like a preamplifier output aimed to be used with active subwoofers. And next to the connector itself, you can see adjustment for sub frequencies, meaning that you can adjust low pass filter where do you want your cutoff to be. But in the manual, it doesn't say what kind of slope it uses or anything else. It's just this small potentiometer that says you can go from 40 to 200 Hertz. And I'm not sure this adjustment is that important because all modern subwoofers that use line level inputs for sub-signal already have their own low-pass filters and sometimes even parametric equalizers that are more advanced, and you can integrate them much better using their own controls instead of using this one. But having it cannot hurt. Having options cannot hurt, I suppose. Then if you look in the front, you'll see few switches on and off, then choosing XLR or RCA input, and then two knobs. And the right one is just a normal volume knob that you would see on any amplifier with volume control. But the left one is actually controlling subwoofer frequencies, and now you wonder, wait, what's that? Why do we have that same control in the back? Well, they serve different purpose. If you adjust a low-pass filter in the back, you control what's getting out of this line level output, of this RCA in the back. But the bottom of the amplifier has this switch that says sub or full range. Normally, the amplifier is set on full range, meaning that these speaker amplified outputs that go to your passive speakers output full range. If you put it onto a sub position, then these speaker binding posts, this amplified output from the amplifier, then you can control a low pass filter on it using this front dial to power your passive subwoofer, and in that case you control the bass frequency using the front dial. Now the question is, how many of you even have passive subwoofers? They were more popular sometimes in the past, not so nowadays, but I know some people still rocking passive subwoofers and actually using some of these small cheap amps to power them. So in that case, this can be useful. Now let's have a quick talk about the power. Aiyima says that with this 48 volts 5 amperes power supply, these amps can deliver up to 300 watts. But I think that some independent measurements got more like 200 realistic watts into 4 ohms, which means it's probably around 100 watts into 8 ohms, and that's also very respectable for the amp of this size. Another thing that might interest you is that this amp has PFFB circuitry, which is basically a feedback loop that makes the output frequency spectrum independent of the load that this amp is feeding. So these chip amps based on this TPA chip are known to have load dependency, so they do not output the exact same frequency response. When they see 8 ohm, 6 ohm, 4 ohm speakers, the frequency spectrum is slightly dependent on the output impedance. But with this PFFB circuitry, that does not happen, or at least it's happening to a much lesser extent. And one final thing before we get to the sound quality is that because these are dual mono amplifiers, so one for each channel, and they do not have a remote control, especially shared remote control or anything like that, you have to adjust the volume on each of these separately, which makes it tedious for me to use them as integrated amps. I simply cannot listen to the music, and then every time I want to change the volume, I adjust both of these and I try for them to be at the exact same spot so stereo works as it's supposed. So for me personally, when used in stereo, these volume knobs are almost useless. And I always tested them connected to another device that has volume control capability. Like my preamp or a DAC that has volume attenuation and a remote. So that said, let's get to how they actually sound. Tonally speaking, Aiyima A70 Monos are mostly neutral, and I can detect maybe just slight leanness in the sound. And that means that the bass line is more on a quick side, not really full, rich and powerful, but it is speedy, resolving and quick. And the whole sound is like that. Mid-range reveals lots of details, and highs once again reveal lots of details. Good thing is that highs, nor mid-range, they don't have any annoying sharpness or edginess, or just they don't sound glary or anything like that. It's just that the bass line itself is a bit leaner to my ears, and the whole sound because of that leans slightly to that lightweight, leaner side of things. But moving to some other stuff like sound staging. Soundstage is reasonably wide. The soundstage has room to breathe, and instruments are well separated from each other, and they're pinpointed quite well left to right. But the soundstage depth is modest. There is a slight sensation of depth, but it's not much. You do not have that like deep virtual space kind of soundstage with these amps. But I also don't know anything else at this price that can do that huge soundstage, so that's okay. And then finally, talking about dynamics, that's like, if we are talking about microdynamics, that's good. These are quick, snappy sounding amplifiers. They are alive sounding. So when we are talking about small details, fast instruments, all of that has good speed and good precision, so microdynamics and snappiness is good. But big dynamic swings, like you would experience in classical music or in movies, for example, these amps don't do that really. They do not have authority and big dynamic scale to pull that off. They keep things more flat and more compressed, which is true for all these TPA chip amps that I've tested before, which actually leads me to comparisons. And the first amp in this comparison is Fosi ZA3, which is a stereo amp that is more affordable than these Aiyima monoblocks. And when I compare them directly, first what I noticed is there is a slight tonal difference. Fosi does sound a bit warmer and a bit juicier in the bass. So if I would listen to vocals, for example, they do sound touch fuller and fuller bodied with Fosi. But there is also another thing that I noticed is Fosi creates narrower soundstage, and these two Aiyyimas can spread soundstage wider, and it feels just a bit airier and more precise. In my experience so far, that is a benefit of having two amps instead of one. I'm not sure if that's because of basically non-existent channel crosstalk or something else, but it was the same case for Fosi V3 monos that I don't have with me right now, but if you go to these pricier Fosi V3 monos, you basically get that same slightly expanded soundstage as you would with Aiyimaz, but with that slightly warmer and fuller in the mid-bass and mid-range Fosi tuning. Aiyimaz are touch more precise, but touch leaner, tonally speaking. Aside from that, not much else to say. Both Aiyimaz and Fosi amps share most of their qualities and limitations. They are clear, clean, transparent sounding, overall speaking, but dynamics on all of these, especially like big scale dynamics, is limited, and the sound staging is decent, but really nothing to write home about. And when I do reviews like this one, people often ask me, but why don't you compare them with pricier amps? And I often just think it's not fair towards these very affordable cheap amps, but I see people are interested and many people do believe that these are giant killers. So I'll quickly make comparisons with two pricier amps. One is Topping PA7 Plus, that I think is $500 or $600 and that one also is limited, constrained when it comes to dynamics in the same way as these monoblocks are. The difference is that PA7 Plus does have darker, more silent background, and it does feel like tones emerge more from a really dark background. In that way, Topping PA7 Plus reminded me on Hagel amps. But as I said, dynamics are pretty much the same. And yeah, one more thing, PA7 Plus feels like it has slightly better and smoother high frequency extension. And when you have these really high frequencies done well, the whole sound sounds a bit glossier, and the high frequencies have more of a continuous kind of sound to them. Less gritty, less grainy, but they have ringy, glossy character to them. And while you don't notice anything lacking with highest frequencies of Aiyima amps, you do notice that PA7 Plus in a direct comparison has more ringy, more continuous sounding. Some people call that coherent in terms of time domain, but I like the word continuous. Highest frequencies compared to this amp. So you pay more, you get upgrades in some parts of the sound, but you mostly keep the same dynamic limitations. Then the next and the priciest comparison that I will make is with Topping B200 monoblocks that are $1,200, so like solid 4 times the price of these Aiyimaz. And when you compare them directly, and of course, if the rest of your system is good enough for you to notice that, but with the right setup, B200s sound more dynamics, they have a noticeably bigger dynamic scales. I can watch movies with B200s and like bass punches and just those dynamic crescendos will sound more impactful and more authoritative. Also, there is a bigger sound stage, airier, wider, and also deeper sound stage, filled with more tiny detailing and information compared to these amps. And now the last part, which is like comparing apples and oranges a bit. Some people asked, what about SMSL A300 and AO200 MKII? They are similarly priced like these Aiyimaz or other TPA amps. And I said it's a bit like apples and oranges because these Aiyimaz and Fosis are basically power amps with a potentiometer serving as a volume attenuator slapped on. And because of that, they are cleaner and more transparent sounding than these two SMSL. But these SMSLs are more of a proper integrated amps. that offer signal buffering and more just signal processing. They have equalization on board, for example, EQ, that you can adjust treble and bass. And while not technically as transparent, they are a bit hazier, they're also more prepared in a way that their preamp sections are made to accept signal from anything you want, including very budget DACs that don't have any volume attenuation, like SMSL SU1, for example, and they will take that signal, buffer it, preamplify it, amplify it, and the sound coming out of these SMSLs will sound more alive and bolder and juicier, but also technically, yes, less revealing and less precise than with these cheap amps. What Aiyima and other TPA amps are offering is more transparency, but also they're more finicky about the signal you're feeding them. If you take that same SMSL SU1 DAC and just feed these amps and then use their own volume attenuation, you will have the sound that is very revealing, very transparent, but quite depleted of energy and with low acoustic mass. Everything will sound a bit lean and thin. And that will be removed if you use either a proper preamplifier that will add that acoustic boldness and acoustic mass, and these can serve only as power amps, or if you use a really good DAC with a really good preamp section, but that kind of DAC costs much more than these power amps, and it defeats the purpose of them being so affordable. So let me try and trickle all of this information in a more simple recommendation. Now, in my mind and to my ears, these cheap amps sound their best if you use them in a very near-field environment, like a desktop environment. In that case, even when used directly with budget DACs and you use their own volume attenuation, you do not notice much, and maybe it's even positive that they do not have much of boldness and acoustic mass. Because speakers are close to you, only a small amount of space around the speakers needs to be filled in with sound, and you and speakers being so closed, you don't want them to project too much sound at you anyway. So you like to keep it simple, clean, pristine. It's great for near-field environment. But if you want an amplifier for your living room or any kind of room where you will sit in a couch or just a few meters away from speakers, and speakers need to project more sound, more acoustic mass into the room to make everything sound a bit bigger, bolder, more alive, I would recommend going with these proper integrated amps like SMSLs, because while you will lose some of the finest detailing and some of the finest transparency, in that use case scenario, you gain something more important. You gain boldness and mass and just bigger sound that sounds more lifelike and more realistic in bigger spaces and in midfield to far field listening position. So have that in mind. Intended use is important. And I can basically easily recommend these Aiyimaz and Fosi amps if you're going to use them in a near field environment, desktop speakers, for gamers, for example, especially when there are smaller speakers that do not have a huge bass output and huge dynamic swings by their nature. It's in their physics, they cannot do that. These small amps will offer great transparency, great tonality, and what they cannot do, your speakers can't do either, so it's not a problem. Their limitations show in a bigger space with a more dynamic, more potent speakers that you know or you heard can output bigger sound, bigger dynamic scales, greater punch, and in those cases I would choose something else. I think it's that simple, and I think this is probably my last TPA amp review. So that would be all for today, guys. Hope you liked the video. See you next time.